She had nothing left. No husband, no harvest, no dignity. Just a crate of bruised, storm-beaten peaches that the whole town had written off as garbage. Bartholomew Griggs had already counted her finished. The neighbors had already started whispering about when she'd finally give up and leave. But Marin Ashcroft knelt in the mud beside those ruined peaches, turned one over in her calloused hands, and made a decision that would change everything. Not just for her, but for every soul in Red Basin. This is a story about what happens when a woman refuses to let the world tell her what's worthless. If you're watching until the end, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning after the hailstorm, Red Basin smelled like rot. It wasn't just the peaches, though there were thousands of them. Split open on the ground, scattered across muddy wagon ruts, piled in bruised heaps along the loading dock behind Griggs's general store. The whole town seemed to exhale failure that morning. Men walked slower. Women pulled shawls tighter, even though the air wasn't cold. The storm had come through fast and mean, the way storms in that part of the territory always did, and it left behind this particular silence that follows destruction. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that rings. Marin Ashcroft stood at the edge of the Callaway orchard with 20 or 30 other people who had come to see the damage for themselves. She was 34 years old, and she looked it in the way that frontier women often did. Not aged badly, but worn honestly. Her hands were rough at the knuckles. There were lines at the corners of her eyes that hadn't been there 3 years ago, before Thomas died. She wore a coat that had been his, the sleeves still a half-inch too long, and she hadn't bothered to hem them because doing so had felt, for a long time, like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit. She watched Griggs walk the rows. Bartholomew Griggs was not a large man physically. He was actually shorter than most of the farmers he did business with, but he had a way of taking up space that made rooms feel smaller when he entered them. He wore good boots always. He spoke in careful, measured sentences, the kind that never quite committed to anything specific enough to be held against him later. He had been the primary buyer and distributor for fruit out of the valley for 11 years, and in that time, he had built something that wasn't quite a monopoly, but functioned like one. If you grew fruit in the Red Basin Valley and wanted to sell it anywhere beyond your own porch, you went through Griggs. He crouched beside a pile of peaches, pressed his thumb into the flesh of one, and stood back up with the same expression he might wear looking at a dead horse. Practical assessment, no sentiment. "Livestock feed," he announced. Not a question. "I'll take the lot off your hands at 4 cents a bushel, which is more than the meat's worth, and you know it." Old man Callaway, who was 61 and had planted that orchard with his own father 30 years back, rubbed his jaw and looked at the ground. 4 cents a bushel. Marin did the math without meaning to. It would barely cover the labor of picking them up. Around her, people nodded the way people nod when they've already decided there's nothing to be done. A woman named Dorothea Hicks said, "Such a shame," in the voice she used for funerals. 2 of the Mercer hands started talking about whether there was enough sound fruit on the Bellamy property to salvage a partial load. Everyone was already moving on in their heads, cataloging losses, adjusting expectations downward the way you had to out here if you wanted to stay sane. Marin kept looking at the peaches. She stepped forward past the edge of the gathered crowd and picked one up. It was badly bruised on one side. Maybe 40% of the surface had gone dark and soft where the hail had beaten it, but the rest of it was intact. The flesh on the undamaged side was still firm, still faintly fragrant, still the color of a late August sunset. She turned it over once, twice. "Mr. Griggs," her voice came out steadier than she felt. "What's the price on a crate? To purchase, I mean. Not sell." The small crowd went quiet, in the particular way that small crowds do when someone says something unexpected. Griggs turned to look at her with an expression she recognized, the brief recalibration of a man who has just remembered that she exists. "Purchase," he repeated. "That's what I said." He looked at the ruined peaches, then back at her, and something shifted behind his eyes. She would think about that shift later and understand it, that it wasn't confusion, it was calculation. He was deciding, in that moment, how much he could charge her for something he'd just publicly declared worthless. 30 cents for a full crate, he said, given the state of them. 30 cents was not a small amount for her. She had $19 and some change in the tin behind her flour sack, the sum total of everything she'd managed to hold on to since Thomas died and left her with a half-cleared homestead, a mule that favored its left hind leg, and debts that Griggs himself held the notes on. 30 cents was 2 weeks of lamp oil or half a bolt of decent wool cloth. "I'll take 2, she said. She heard Dorothea Hicks make a sound, not quite a laugh, more like a compressed breath of disbelief. Someone behind her muttered something she didn't catch. She kept her eyes on Griggs, who had already started the small smile that he used when he believed he was being generous in the act of taking advantage of someone. 2 crates, he agreed. I'll have them loaded. Bet. She drove the crates home on the wagon with her spine straight and her jaw set, and she didn't let herself think too hard about what she'd just done until she was back on her own property, with the mule unhitched and the crates sitting on the porch boards. Then she sat down on the step and put her face in her hands. The homestead was 80 acres of hard-worked land on the eastern edge of the valley. Thomas had chosen the plot because of the well, deep, clean water that some of the other parcels didn't have. And he'd spent 4 years breaking ground, pulling stumps, planting the kitchen garden, and the small wheat field that had never quite yielded what he'd hoped for. He died in the spring of the 3rd year from a fever that moved too fast for anyone to do much about. He was 37. He had been building a fence along the north pasture when it started, and sometimes Maren still saw the half-finished posts from the kitchen window and felt the specific weight of things that get left undone. She had stayed because leaving felt worse than staying, because the well was good and she knew the soil now, and because somewhere in her chest there was a stubbornness that even grief hadn't been able to fully dismantle. But she was running out of money in the way that happens gradually, and then all at once. She owed Griggs on the land note. Thomas had borrowed against the property to fund the original equipment purchase, and the interest had a way of keeping the principal from shrinking meaningfully. She had sold the second mule last fall. She had stopped buying coffee. And now she had spent 60 cents on bruised peaches. She pressed her fingers against her eyes until the pressure felt grounding, then stood up and carried the first crate inside. The idea had been forming for longer than she'd admitted to herself. She'd grown up watching her mother put up preserves every summer, not as a tradition or a pleasure exactly, but as serious practical work. Her mother, Ruth, had been a methodical woman who kept notes in a small leather book about ratios and timing and what temperature the jars needed to reach for a proper seal. She'd had opinions about pectin and strong ones about sugar. She'd believed, with the conviction of someone who had gone hungry as a child, that preserved food was a form of freedom, that having enough put by meant no one could make you desperate. Ruth's silver brooch was the only thing of value Maren had kept when she'd sold off what she could after Thomas died. It was a small oval piece, simple, with a pattern of leaves around the edge that had been worn smooth by years of wear. Ruth had pinned it to her collar every Sunday, and Maren kept it in the same tin with her money because somehow that proximity felt right. She looked at it now, picked it up, set it back down. She needed more sugar than she had on hand, and sugar wasn't cheap. She needed jars, dozens of them, maybe more. She needed paraffin for sealing. She needed time and enough firewood to keep a consistent boil. She did the arithmetic twice on a scrap of paper, and the numbers were uncomfortable but not impossible. If she could work the fruit carefully enough, separate what was usable from what wasn't, and if her mother's ratios still held, she picked the brooch up again and looked at it for a long moment. Then she put on her coat and walked back to town. At Griggs's store, she asked to see what he had in the way of sugar. He had 30 pounds in stock, which was most of what she needed. Running low on preserves, he asked, which was what passed for small talk from him. Something like that. She put her money on the counter, and she did not look at his face when he counted it out, because she didn't want him reading anything in her expression. She had learned that about him, that he watched people's faces the way some men watched the weather, looking for information. She also asked, quietly, whether Mrs. Pavola at the dry goods had any empty canning jars. Griggs said he thought she might have a box or two, salvaged from the Hendricks estate sale. Maren bought the sugar, loaded it in the wagon, and stopped at the dry goods. Mrs. Pavola had 22 jars, which wasn't enough but was a start. Maren paid for those too. On the way home, she stopped at the Novak property, which sat between town and her homestead on the Old Creek Road. Zofia Novak was 68, and had come over from somewhere in Eastern Europe 20-some years ago with her husband, who had died before Marin ever arrived in the valley. She was the kind of woman who didn't explain herself much and didn't expect other people to either. She kept chickens and an aggressive kitchen garden and a small greenhouse she'd built herself out of salvaged window glass. And she had the best preserved beets Marin had ever tasted. Marin knocked, and Zofia answered and looked at her in the direct way she had of looking at people, like she was assessing the structural integrity of a wall. "Jars," Marin said. "Do you have any to spare?" "Empty ones. I can pay or trade." Zofia studied her for a moment. "Come in." She led Marin through the narrow kitchen and into the back room, which smelled like dried herbs and something smoky, and was lined on two walls with shelves that held more jars than Marin could count at a glance. Full ones and empty ones, mixed together in what looked like chaos, but probably wasn't. "How many you need?" "As many as you have to spare." Zofia made a sound in her throat. Not quite approval, but something adjacent to it. She started pulling empty jars from the shelves, setting them on a worn wooden table. "You bought those Hale peaches," she said. It wasn't a question. "I did." "Everyone thinks you've gone soft in the head." Zofia said it without cruelty, just as information. "I know." "Have you?" Marin looked at the jars collecting on the table. "I don't think so." Zofia made that sound again. She pulled out another 8 jars. "My mother used to say that the best fruit comes from the tree that fights to grow. Rocks in the soil, frost at the wrong time, drought one year and flood the next." She set the last jar down and looked at Marin steadily. "Scarred fruit is still fruit. You know that or you wouldn't be here." Marin drove home with 44 jars rattling in the wagon bed and the beginnings of something she couldn't yet name steadying itself inside her chest. She started that night. The work was harder and more detailed than she'd remembered from watching her mother do it. Sorting came first, going through every peach piece by piece under the lamp, cutting out the bruised sections with a small knife, salvaging what could be saved. There was more salvageable fruit than she'd expected. Maybe 60% of the total weight, which was better than she'd hoped. The damaged portions she set aside in a separate bucket. Nothing got wasted. She'd figure out what to do with the rest later. She worked until past midnight that first night and woke before dawn to start again. The cooking was exacting. Her mother's ratios lived in her hands more than her head. She found herself measuring by feel as much as by the tin cup she used as a scoop, tasting as she went, adjusting. The kitchen filled with a smell that was unexpectedly, piercingly sweet. Not the clean sweetness of fresh fruit, but something deeper and more complicated, cooked down and concentrated until it was almost amber. The first batch didn't seal right. 3 jars lost their vacuum overnight, and she had to reprocess them, which cost her more fuel and more time. She made a note, adjusted the boil time. The second batch sealed perfectly. She held one of the finished jars up to the window in the early morning light and looked at the color of it. Deep gold with threads of burnt orange where the fruit had caramelized against the jar's edge. It was, she thought, one of the more honest things she'd ever made. You could see exactly what had gone into it. Nothing hidden, nothing prettied up. She set it on the shelf and went back to work. On the 4th day, a knock at her door interrupted the 3rd batch mid-stir, which irritated her. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened it. Finn Mercer was standing on her porch. He was 11 years old and had been living at the Mercer farm as a kind of informal arrangement that nobody discussed too directly. He wasn't exactly family, wasn't exactly hired, wasn't exactly a charity case, but existed in that uncomfortable space between all three. His parents had come through the valley when he was very small and had kept moving without him, which was the version of the story people told when children were present. He was thin in the way children get when meals aren't reliable, and he had very serious gray eyes that tracked things carefully, like he was always calculating exit routes. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said, "I heard you're doing preserves." "Who told you that?" "Mrs. Novak. She said you might need help with the jars." He paused. "I'm good with jars. I helped her put up 40 quarts of tomatoes last summer." Marin looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them was the kind of person who filled silences unnecessarily. "I can't pay much," she said. "I know." He shrugged, and there was something in that shrug. Not resignation, something more considered than that. like he'd already done the calculation and decided the terms were acceptable. "I don't have anywhere to be before supper." She stepped back from the door. "Don't touch anything on the stove. Wash your hands first. The basin's in the corner." He came inside and washed his hands without being told a second time, and he looked around her kitchen with those careful eyes and didn't say a word about the jars lined up on every available surface, or the fruit-stained cloth on the table, or the way the whole place smelled like a different kind of summer than the one they were actually having. "What do you need me to do?" he asked. "See those peaches in the bucket? I need them cut into quarters, like this," she showed him. "Anything that's brown all the way through, set it aside. Anything with firm flesh, quarters." He nodded and got to work. He was good at it, she discovered. Quick and methodical, without the tendency children sometimes had to ask questions every 2 minutes or narrate what they were doing. He worked quietly and competently, and when he finished one bucket, he looked at her and waited for the next instruction without demanding acknowledgement for what he'd already done. By the end of that afternoon, they had processed everything in the second crate. Marin stood at the stove stirring the last batch of the day, and Finn sat at the table counting jars and making careful tally marks on a scrap of paper she'd given him. 63, he said, plus the ones from before. That's 81. 81 jars. She looked at them stacked on the shelves, filling the windowsills, lined up along the floor beside the far wall. The light through the window caught them, and they glowed, amber and gold and deep orange, the light moving through the preserved fruit like something warm and alive. She decided to call them Stormfire Gold, not as a selling name necessarily, just as a name, something that described what they actually were. 81, she said. "We could probably do another 10 or 15 if you had more jars," Finn said, still looking at his tally. "Mrs. Novak has some more she said you could have." Marin stirred the pot. Outside, the last of the evening light was going flat and gray. Somewhere in town, people were still talking about the ruined harvest, still tallying losses, still shaking their heads about the widow who'd spent good money on garbage fruit. Let them talk. She had 81 jars of something that didn't exist anywhere else in the valley, and winter was coming, and she was just getting started. By the end of the second week, Marin had stopped counting the jars individually and started counting them in rows. 12 rows of 8 on the main shelving unit Thomas had built along the kitchen's south wall, the one she'd always used for flour and dried beans and the occasional bag of salt. The beans were on the floor now in a burlap sack she kept tripping over in the dark, and the flour had migrated to the corner of the bedroom where it had no business being, but the shelves were full of Stormfire Gold, and that felt like the correct use of the space. 96 jars, then 102. Then, after a third trip to Zophia's and a careful excavation of the root cellar of the abandoned Dempsey homestead half a mile east, where Finn had found 14 intact mason jars still packed in old straw, dusty but uncracked. 119. The Dempsey place had been empty for 3 years. Nobody talked about why the family had left, which in Red Basin usually meant everybody knew and nobody wanted to say it out loud. Marin had gone there twice before, after Thomas died, just to walk the empty rooms and feel something other than the particular loneliness of her own walls. She hadn't taken anything then. It had felt wrong, like rifling through someone else's grief. But this time she had Finn with her, and his presence made it feel less like trespassing and more like practical problem-solving, which was probably a distinction that wouldn't hold up under moral examination, but worked well enough for an afternoon. "There's a whole shelf of them in the back room," Finn said, his voice coming from somewhere behind a collapsed interior wall. "Some of them got broken, but most of them are okay. You want me to wrap them in my coat?" "Use the sacking in the wagon," Marin called back. "Your coat's not thick enough." She heard him moving around, the careful sounds of someone handling fragile things. Outside, the wind was picking up again, not threatening yet, but with the dry edge that meant the temperature would drop tonight. She stood in the doorway of the Dempsey kitchen and looked at the rusted stove, the empty wall where a calendar had hung long enough to leave a pale rectangle, the window with one cracked pane patched with oil paper that someone had cut and fitted with care. People built things carefully and then left them anyway. That was one of the things the frontier taught you if you were paying attention. 14, Finn said, appearing around the door frame with his arms full of sacking bundles. "A couple more that I wasn't sure about. I left those." "Good judgment," Marin said, and meant it. He looked at her briefly, like compliments were things he needed to process before he could respond to them. The two I left had hairline cracks, he said, as though explaining it to himself as much as to her. They'd probably fail under heat anyway. Yes, she said, they would. They loaded the wagon in the gray afternoon and drove back to the homestead, and Marin thought about the word judgment, how it was a thing Finn used carefully and practically, like a tool he'd learned to trust because he'd had so few others. What? The trouble with working through the night was that the mind wandered into territory the daylight kept shut. Thomas had been a decent cook, which had surprised her when they first married. She'd expected, based on nothing in particular except the way men tended to be, that he wouldn't be. But he'd made a good venison stew and better biscuits than she did, and on Sunday mornings he'd sometimes make griddle cakes and stand at the stove in his undershirt with flour on his forearms and whistle tunelessly while the fat popped in the pan. She'd loved him for that. Not for the griddle cakes specifically, but for the evidence they provided that he was a person who took small pleasures seriously. She thought about him less often than she used to, which was its own specific grief. Not sharper than the original, just differently shaped. Like the difference between a fresh bruise and a healed scar that still ached when the weather changed. She stirred the pot and adjusted the flame and tried to think about sugar ratios instead. Finn had taken to showing up before she expected him and leaving after the light failed, which she hadn't asked him to do and hadn't told him was appreciated, because saying so would have made both of them uncomfortable in different ways. He was learning the process fast, faster than she'd expected. He'd started predicting when a batch was ready before she told him, based on color and the way the surface moved when she stirred. "That one's getting close," he said one evening, not looking up from the jars he was checking for seal integrity, pressing each lid down with his thumb. Marin looked at the pot. He was right. Maybe 3 minutes more. "How did you know?" she asked. He thought about it. "The bubbles change. They get slower and bigger, like the whole thing is getting heavier." She looked at the pot again. He was right about that too. She hadn't put it into words before, but that was exactly it. "Your mother ever put up preserves?" she asked, and then wished she hadn't, because the question assumed information about his mother that she didn't actually have. He didn't react badly, though. He pressed the next lid and moved on to the one after it. "I don't remember," he said. "Not sad exactly, just factual." Marin said, "The bubbles getting heavier is a good way to put it." He nodded once and kept working. Word that she was making preserves had spread through town in the way things spread in small places, not through announcement, but through the accumulation of small observations. Zofia had told 1 or 2 people, probably. Someone had seen the wagon loaded with jars. Someone else had smelled the cooking when the window was open and put pieces together. The response had been, predictably, amusement. She heard about it secondhand and sideways. Dorothea Hicks mentioning to Mrs. Pavola that it was sweet, really, what Marin was attempting, with the particular intonation that made sweet mean its exact opposite. One of the Calloway boys asking Finn at the feed store whether the widow Ashcroft was planning to sell her jam at the church social, which was a joke that relied on the assumption that nothing serious could come from what she was doing. Finn had apparently said, "She's not making jam," and walked out without further explanation, which Marin found more satisfying than she probably should have. But there was also Hector Blaine, who ran the small freighting operation out of the north end of town, stopping her on the street one afternoon with a nod that was respectful, if cautious. "Heard you bought the hail fruit," he said. "That's right. Heard you're putting it up." He rubbed the back of his neck. "My wife's been after me to find preserves for the winter. We lost all of ours in the root cellar flood last spring." "You planning to sell?" Marin looked at him evenly. "I'm not ready to sell yet." "Okay." He nodded, not offended. "When you are, let me know before you take it to market. My wife has strong opinions about peach preserves." She told him she would, and walked on, and filed that conversation away like a jar on a shelf. The town's laughter didn't bother her the way it might have a year ago. There had been a period in the first months after Thomas died when what people thought of her had felt enormously important, as though their opinion of her competence was the only measure she had, since Thomas had been the one who knew the land and she'd been learning it from scratch. She'd made mistakes then, visible ones. She'd planted too late and harvested too early, and spent 2 weeks nursing a sick mule back to health, only to have it pull up lame the following month. People had been kind about some of it, which was sometimes worse than unkindness because it required her to perform gratitude when what she felt was humiliation. But she'd been here 3 years now, and the land had taught her things, and she was less interested in what people thought and more interested in what she knew. What she knew was this: winter in the valley was long and tight-fisted. The peach blight had been spreading through the valley before the hailstorm. She'd seen the spotted leaves on the Callaway trees herself, had noticed the way the fruit on the southern end of the orchard had been coming in small and discolored even before the storm hit. She didn't know how bad it was going to get, because nobody was talking about it plainly yet, but she had a sense. The way you develop a sense for weather when you live close to the land long enough, not prescience, just attention. She was paying attention. Zofia came by one Thursday afternoon, which she'd never done before. She usually waited to be visited rather than visiting, a distinction Marin respected. She arrived with a cloth-covered plate of something that turned out to be a dense, slightly sour pastry she called kolache, which she set on the kitchen table without ceremony, and then stood looking at the shelves of finished jars with her arms crossed. "More than I thought," she said. "More than I thought, too." Marin put the kettle on. "Sit down, Zofia. I can see standing." But she sat. She looked at the jars for another long moment, then at Marin. "You're not going to sell them small?" It wasn't a question, but Marin answered it anyway. "No." "Griggs came to my door yesterday," Zofia said. "Asked me, very politely, if I knew what you were planning to do with the hail fruit preserves." She said it in a tone that communicated what she thought of the politeness. "I told him I didn't know anything about any preserves." Marin set 2 cups on the table. "Thank you. I didn't do it for you. I did it because he's asked me questions before and then used the answers in ways that didn't benefit the person he was asking about." Zofia accepted the tea. "He's been watching you. Not in an obvious way, but he's paying attention." Marin thought about that. Griggs paid attention to things that might become valuable. It was one of the mechanisms of how he'd accumulated his position over 11 years. He'd sold her the damaged peaches as though they were garbage, but he wasn't stupid. He'd have done the math eventually. Would have remembered that Marin Ashcroft's mother had been known for her preserves, would have started wondering what a woman like that might produce from even damaged fruit. "He thinks I'll need him," Marin said. "You do owe him money," Zofia said, not unkindly. "I know what I owe him." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "I'm going to repay it." Zofia studied her in the assessing way she had. "Out of the preserves? If the price is right. And if Griggs decides to make the price not right?" Marin looked at her. "Then I'll find a way around him." Zofia made her throat sound again. The one that wasn't quite approval, but lived next door to it. She broke off a piece of the kolache and pushed the plate toward Marin. "My mother used to say something, roughly translated from a language you don't speak. The woman who survives the frost learns more about the cold than the woman who was kept inside all winter." "That's a good thing to say." "My mother was a good woman." Zofia ate her pastry without further elaboration. Sorry. Griggs came to her door on a Friday, at the end of the 3rd week. She'd been expecting him for several days, had been watching the road from the kitchen window each morning while the first batch of the day was going, not with anxiety exactly, but with the focused attention of someone who wants to see a thing coming rather than be surprised by it. He knocked twice, evenly, and waited. She counted to 5 before answering because she didn't want him to know she'd been watching. He was wearing his good coat, the one he wore when he was making an official kind of call rather than just passing through. And he was carrying his hat in his hands, which was a gesture of deference he probably didn't mean but had learned produced results. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said pleasantly. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "I'm in the middle of a batch," she said. "I've got a few minutes." She didn't invite him inside, which was a deliberate choice she was sure he registered. They stood in the doorway, the smell of cooking fruit drifting out from behind her. He glanced past her at the shelves, and she watched his eyes move across the jars, counting, estimating, before they came back to her face. "That's a fine operation you've got going," he said. "It's a start, more than a start from what I can see." He turned the hat in his hands. "I won't waste your time, Marin. I think we both know what those jars are worth, and I think we both know that selling them through proper channels, through a distributor with reach, would net you considerably more than hawking them out of a wagon on market day. I haven't said anything about market day. No, he agreed smoothly. You haven't said much of anything, which is your right. But I've been in this business a long time, and I can tell you that the difference between a woman who makes a good product and a woman who makes a profitable product is usually someone with the right connections. He paused. I have those connections. Marin leaned against the doorframe. What kind of arrangement are you thinking? I'd take the lot off your hands at 60 cents a jar. Fair price, given the source material. You'd clear enough to cover what you owe me and have something left over. He said it the way he said most things, reasonably, without emphasis, as though he was simply presenting facts. She did the math. 119 jars at 60 cents was $71.40. Her debt to him was $53 on the land note, plus the accumulated interest she'd been letting sit because she hadn't had the money to address it, which she estimated at somewhere between $8 and $12, depending on how he'd been calculating it. At 60 cents a jar, she'd come out ahead by maybe $6 to $10. $6 to $10. After everything. She looked at him steadily. I'll think about it. Something moved across his face, too fast to name, but she caught it. He'd expected yes. Of course, he said. Don't think too long. Winter comes fast out here. She knew when she was being reminded of something. It does, she said. Thank you for stopping by, Mr. Griggs. After he left, she went back to the stove and stood at it for a long time, stirring without needing to, running the numbers again. 60 cents was not a fair price. She didn't know yet what the exact right price was. She had only estimates, impressions, the conversation with Hector Blaine and what she could infer from the cost of fruit in lean years. But she knew in the certain way you know things that live in your stomach rather than your head, that 60 cents was Griggs deciding what her labor was worth to him, not what it was actually worth. The question was what she could do about it. Chang. The answer came partly from Finn. He arrived the next morning to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of paper covered in figures, the tea gone cold beside her hand. You look like you haven't slept, he said. I slept some. She pushed the paper aside. Griggs came yesterday. Finn sat down across from her without being invited, which he'd started doing somewhere in the second week, and she'd stopped noticing it because it had stopped seeming like presumption and started seeming like what it was. What did he want? To buy everything at 60 cents a jar. Finn was quiet for a moment. What are they worth? More than that. She tapped the paper. I've been trying to figure out how much more. I don't have enough information. He looked at the figures upside down, turning his head slightly. The hotel in Capstone sells preserved fruit. He stopped. Someone told me that the hotel there sells fancy preserves in the dining room, individual jars. Marin looked at him. How much? I don't know exactly, but it was a lot. Enough that it got mentioned as a notable thing. Capstone was 3 hours east by wagon, the nearest real city, with a railroad stop and 2 hotels and a restaurant district that served travelers coming through on the line. It was a different world from Red Basin, in the way that anywhere with a train station was a different world from anywhere without one. She'd never thought about Capstone before as a market. She'd been thinking about Red Basin, thinking about market day, thinking about what the Valley families needed and what they could afford. But if there was a hotel dining room buying fancy preserves, and Stormfire Gold was, she believed with a precision that wasn't vanity, but assessment, a premium product from premium processing. Then the arithmetic of the whole situation changed. Do you know which hotel? She asked. The Meridian, I think. She wrote it on the corner of the paper, stared at it. Then she put the paper face down and picked up her cup. Okay, she said. First batch. Finn stood up and went to wash his hands without being told. Marin stirred the fire to life under the stove and thought about Capstone and about the difference between what a thing was worth to someone who needed to sell it and what it was worth to someone who needed to have it. She found the last of the jars on a Tuesday. There was an old root cellar on the eastern edge of her own property that she almost never went into because the entrance had partially collapsed 2 autumns ago and she'd never fixed it. Thomas had meant to shore up the timbers that winter and hadn't gotten to it before the fever came. She'd been working around the cellar entrance for 2 years, stepping over the rotted beam, telling herself she'd deal with it. Finn was the one who said, one afternoon when they were scraping the bottom of the jar supply again, What about that cellar? I saw it when I was checking the fence line. Looks like there might be storage in there. Entrance is bad, Marin said. I'm smaller than you. She started to say no and then looked at him, at the serious, practical face he made when he'd already calculated something through and was presenting the result, and said instead, "Be careful." He disappeared into the collapsed entrance, and she stood above him listening to him move around in the dark below for 10 minutes that felt longer than they were, and then his voice came up muffled through the ground. 18 jars, all intact, and a good knife someone left down here. Keep the knife, she called back. He emerged with dirt on both knees and his hair full of cobwebs, carrying jars 2 at a time in the crook of each arm. She counted them as he set them in the grass. 18, as promised. Old ones, thick-walled, the kind they didn't make the same way anymore. She picked one up and looked at it. Heavy, solid, the kind of jar that would seal tight and hold. Good find, she said. Finn looked at the dirt on his knees with something that might, on a different face, have been satisfaction. On his face it was harder to read, more contained, more guarded, the expression of someone who had learned not to show too much because showing too much was something that had cost him before. We're over 130 now, he said. She ran the count in her head. 137 if the last batch holds. He nodded. He looked at the cellar entrance and then at the jars lined in the grass. Mrs. Ashcroft, he said in a tone that meant he was about to say something he'd been turning over for a while. When you sell these, wherever you sell them, are you going to be okay? With Griggs, I mean. She looked at the jars too. I'm going to be okay. He doesn't like being told no. I know. He's told people that. Finn paused. That he doesn't like it. Marin set the jar down carefully in the grass. She thought about the way Griggs had stood in her doorway with his hat in his hands, the particular calculation that lived behind his pleasant manner, the way he'd looked at her shelves like he was already counting her inventory as his own. Finn, she said, have you ever seen a jar that looked worthless from the outside? All cloudy glass, dull lid, nothing special, and then you hold it up to the light and what's inside it is perfect? He thought about it seriously, the way he thought about most things. Yeah, he said, a few times. That's what she's going to do, Marin said. Hold it up to the light. He looked at her for a moment, and she saw him decide to believe her. Not because he was naive, but because he'd been watching her work for 3 weeks and had drawn his own conclusions about what she was capable of. Okay, he said, and he picked up 2 more jars and carried them toward the house. The shelves were full now, 137 jars of Stormfire gold, catching the late afternoon light, glowing amber and deep orange against the dark wood. Outside, the first real cold of the season was settling in. Not winter yet, but the suggestion of it, the dry edge in the air that said what was coming. Marin stood in the middle of her kitchen and looked at everything she'd made out of what the storm had broken, and she felt something that wasn't triumph exactly, and wasn't relief, and wasn't peace. It was the feeling of a decision fully made, the particular weight of a thing you've committed to so completely that doubt doesn't have room to live anymore. She went to the shelf and picked up 1 jar, turned it in her hands, set it back. Then she went to the window and looked out at the road that led toward Capstone and started planning. She left for Capstone on a Wednesday before first light. Finn had offered to come and she'd told him no, not unkindly, but clearly. This was the kind of errand that needed to be done alone, where the outcome would be determined by things she couldn't rehearse and couldn't share the weight of with an 11-year-old boy who had already given more than anyone had asked him to. She told him to check the jars in her absence, make sure none of the seals had failed, and to tell no one where she'd gone. He'd nodded once, the way he always did when he understood something completely and didn't need it repeated. She loaded 12 jars into the wagon, a representative selection, various batch runs, the range of color from bright gold to deep amber, packed them in straw and covered them with the good canvas tarp, and hitched the mule in the dark. The animal was not happy about the hour, neither was she, but the wagon was rolling by the time the first gray light started defining the tree line, and she settled into the bench with her coat pulled tight and let the rhythm of the wheels on the frozen road fill in the silence. 3 hours gave her time to think, which was not entirely a gift. She thought about what Finn had said, the Meridian Hotel, Capstone, fancy preserves in the dining room. She had no contact there, no introduction, no letter of reference from anyone who mattered in a city context. She had 12 jars of preserves made from hail-damaged fruit in a canvas-covered wagon, and a plan that consisted mostly of walking in the front door and asking to speak to whoever made purchasing decisions for the kitchen. She had done harder things. She told herself that. She had done harder things, and they had not always worked out. She told herself that too because it was true, and because she had learned to distrust the kind of confidence that forgot inconvenient facts. Capstone was louder than she remembered. She'd been there twice before, once when Thomas was alive to register the land deed, and once after he died to sort out a paperwork problem at the county clerk's office that had taken most of a day and left her more exhausted than the journey itself. Both times she'd been focused on a specific errand and moved through the city like water through a channel, keeping to the task, not looking sideways. Today, she had to look sideways. She had to find the Meridian Hotel, which turned out to be on the main commercial street, a 4-story building with a painted sign and window boxes that still held the dried remnants of summer flowers, brown and crisp in the November cold. There was a doorman at the front entrance and a row of polished brass fixtures along the awning that were clearly meant to communicate the kind of establishment that didn't need to announce itself because it already knew what it was. Marin parked the wagon in the side alley, covered the jars, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment looking at the front entrance. Then she carried 2 jars in the crook of her arm, walked around to the service entrance on the building's north side, and knocked. The man who answered was broad and efficient looking, with a white apron and the expression of someone managing a great many competing demands. "Kitchen deliveries at the back," he said, already starting to close the door. "I'm not delivering," Marin said. "I'm presenting for purchase consideration. I need 5 minutes with whoever manages kitchen procurement." He looked at her, then at the jars. "We have suppliers." "I know you do. 5 minutes." Something in her tone, not aggressive, just absolutely certain, made him pause. He held the door another moment. "Wait here." She waited for 11 minutes, which she counted without looking at a clock by estimating from the sound of the kitchen behind the door. The rhythm of a working kitchen has its own kind of time. When the door opened again, the man held it for a thin woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and flour on her left sleeve. "Mrs. Deckard," the man said. "She wants to talk about a preserve." Mrs. Deckard looked at the jars and then at Marin with the comprehensive assessment of a woman who processed a great deal of information quickly. "You have 2 minutes," she said. "I have a lunch service." "That's fine." Marin held out one of the jars. "This is Stormfire Gold, peach preserve, single valley origin, this season's fruit. I'd like you to taste it before I tell you anything else about it." Mrs. Deckard took the jar and looked at the color through the glass. She had the eye of someone who understood what she was looking at. Marin could see it in the way she tilted the jar, not casually, but with the specific angle of someone assessing clarity and color distribution. "Do you have a spoon?" Marin asked. Mrs. Deckard turned and said something to the man behind her, who disappeared and returned with a small tasting spoon. She opened the jar herself, clean pop of the seal, brought the spoon to her nose first, then tasted. She didn't say anything for a moment. She looked at the jar again. "There's something different in here," she said. "Not just peach." "The fruit was stressed," Marin said. "Hail damage. When you cook down stressed fruit, the sugars concentrate differently. You get more depth." She paused. "It's not better because of what happened to it, but it's different because of it." Mrs. Deckard tasted a second time, smaller amount, more deliberate. "How many jars?" 137 total. I have 12 in my wagon." "Price?" "That depends on volume and arrangement." Marin had practiced this part. "I'm not interested in selling the lot at a flat rate to a middleman. I'm interested in a direct arrangement, standing price per jar, reorder when you need more." "We can't guarantee reorder. Next season your fruit may not be the same." "It won't be?" "Next seasons will be different." Marin looked at her steadily. "But I'll be honest with you about what it is when I bring it, and I won't sell you something that doesn't meet what you tasted today." Mrs. Deckard looked at the jar for another moment. $1.25 per jar, if I take 20 to start. $1.25 per jar. Marin kept her face level through what felt like a considerable internal recalibration. At 60 cents a jar, Griggs's number, 20 jars would have been $12. At $1.25, it was $25 for the same 20 jars. For all 137, the arithmetic was almost uncomfortable to do standing in a hotel service doorway. 140? Marin said. Mrs. Deckard looked at her, not annoyed, more like she was confirming something she'd already suspected about the woman standing in front of her. 130, she said, and I need the 12 you have today. Done. She didn't bring the wagon around to the front. She went back to the alley, lifted the 12 jars out of the straw herself, and carried them in 2 trips through the service door. Mrs. Deckard counted out $15.60 in paper and coin from a small cash box, which Marin folded and put in her coat pocket without counting in front of her. If these sell well in the dining room, Mrs. Deckard said, I'll want more before January. I'll have them, Marin said. On the drive home, she didn't let herself do the full arithmetic until she was out of the city limits and back on the open road. The mule setting its own pace, the afternoon light going flat and gold across the empty fields. 125 jars remaining. At $1.30 each, that was $162.50. Her debt to Griggs, including what she'd estimated for interest, was at most $65. She drove the rest of the way home without stopping. The blight came the second week of November, fast and quiet the way the worst things always came. It started on the far end of the Bellamy orchard. Someone noticed the leaves going dark and curled in a way that wasn't right for the season, and by the time old Silas Bellamy thought to pull a branch and get a close look, it had already moved through a third of his trees. Within 4 days, it had jumped to the Callaway property. Within a week, it was in 3 other orchards, and the word moving through Red Basin had shifted from concern to something closer to dread. Marin heard about it the way she heard most things, from the road, from fragments of conversation at the dry goods, from the look on people's faces when they came out of Griggs's store. She walked through the Callaway orchard herself one afternoon when she knew no one would be there, and she stood among the darkened trees and looked at the damage and understood what it meant. It meant there would be no preserved peaches from the valley this winter. Not from the orchards, not from anyone's kitchen garden that depended on those trees. The valley's primary fruit crop, the one that families counted on for winter stores, was gone. What she had on her shelves, 125 jars after the capstone sale, sitting in amber rows in her kitchen, was all there was going to be. She drove back to the homestead and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. This was the thing she hadn't let herself think about too directly. That the scarcity which made her preserves valuable also meant that people she knew, people who had scraped through the same hard season she had, were going to face a winter without the stores they'd counted on. The Callaways, who had 3 young children. The widow Prentice, who was older and had nobody to help her put up food. Hector Blaine, who had mentioned his wife's strong opinions about peach preserves, and who was a good man who paid his debts on time. She could sell everything to the Meridian. She had the contact now, the relationship, the agreed price. Mrs. Deckard had made clear she could move more product than she'd bought in that first transaction. Marin could clear her debt to Griggs, reclaim her mother's brooch from the tin where it had been sitting like a small accusation since she'd almost pawned it for sugar money, and come out a winner with more financial stability than she'd had since Thomas died. She could do all of that. It was legal. It was reasonable. It was what the arithmetic said to do. She looked at the rows of jars. Then she thought about what they'd cost. Not just the money. She'd tracked every cent and could account for it. She meant the other cost. The night she hadn't slept. The way her hands had smelled like peaches for so long she'd stopped noticing it. The morning she'd burned a batch because she'd fallen asleep at the table and woken to smoke and ruin, and she'd sat on the kitchen floor for a full 10 minutes before she could make herself get up and start again. Finn's scraped knees from the Dempsey cellar, Zophia's jars, and what she'd said about scarred fruit. All of that was in the jars, too. She was still sitting at the table when Finn arrived the next morning, and he took one look at her face and didn't say anything immediately, which was one of his better qualities. He made himself useful at the shelves, checking seals, and after a while he said, without turning around, "You heard about the blight." "Yes. Everyone at the Mercer farm is worried. Mrs. Mercer was talking about whether they could get supplies from Capstone before the roads got bad." He paused. "It's going to be a hard winter." "Yes," Marin said again. He turned around. "You're thinking about selling to the town instead of the hotel." She looked at him. "I'm thinking about all of it." "You don't have to." "I know. You could sell everything to the hotel and no one could say you did anything wrong. He wasn't pushing either direction. He was just being accurate, which she appreciated. You earned those jars. I did. She pressed both palms flat on the table. That's not really the question. He thought about it. What is? She didn't answer immediately. She got up and went to the window and looked at the road. The same road she'd been looking at since she'd come back from Capstone. The one that went east toward the city and west toward town. 2 directions. 2 very different kinds of math. The question, she said slowly, is what kind of person I was making those jars for. Griggs found out about Capstone on a Thursday. She didn't know exactly how. Whether he'd had someone watch the road, whether the information had come from Capstone itself through whatever network he maintained, or whether it was simply the kind of thing that happened in small places where everything eventually leaked. But he came to her door again, and this time he didn't carry his hat in his hands. He stood on her porch with a different energy, still controlled, still measured, but with something underneath it that hadn't been there the first time. Something with edges. I heard you made a trip to Capstone, he said. I did. Made a sale. That's right. He looked past her at the shelves, and this time the look was different. It was the look of a man recalculating. I also heard, he said, that you didn't mention to Mrs. Deckard at the Meridian that you had outstanding debt obligations that might affect the legality of independent sales. He paused. The land note I hold includes a first rights clause on commercial sale of produce from the property. Marin felt something go cold and steady in her chest. She'd read the land note. She'd read it twice before she and Thomas had signed it, and once more by herself after he died. She knew what it said. The first rights clause applies to agricultural commodity sales through established market channels, she said. Grain, livestock, raw fruit. I sold processed preserves to a hotel dining room. The peaches came from your property. The peaches came from the Callaway orchard. I bought them. A pause. The faintest shift in his expression. Be careful, Marin. I'm being careful, she said. I've been being careful. You sold me those peaches as damaged goods for 30 cents a crate. They weren't grown on my property, they weren't my agricultural commodity, and the first rights clause in a land note doesn't cover a purchasing transaction. She kept her voice level. I've been through the language, Mr. Griggs. I know what it says. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, the pleasantness was mostly gone, and what was underneath it was something she'd suspected for a long time but hadn't seen clearly until now. Not cruelty exactly, but indifference. The particular indifference of a man who had been comfortable for so long that other people's difficulty had become simply a resource category. You still owe me $53 principal, he said, plus interest, which I've been patient about. That patience has limits. I know what I owe you, Marin said. I'll have it by market day. He looked at her for a long moment. All of it. All of it. Something moved in his face. The recalibration again. The quick internal math. He'd expected her to negotiate, to ask for more time, to do the thing people usually did when he reminded them of their debts, which was to become slightly smaller and more accommodating. She hadn't done that. Market day, he said. Market day, she agreed. After he left, she stood in the doorway for a moment, breathing the cold November air, and then she went inside and sat down and unfolded the paper where she'd been doing her calculations for the last 3 days. She needed to decide, and she needed to decide before market day, which was 8 days out. She went to Zofia that evening. The old woman answered the door in her housecoat, took one look at Marin's face, and stepped back to let her in without a word. The kitchen smelled like bread and something savory simmering on the back of the stove, and a lamp was burning low on the table where Zofia had been doing something with needle and thread that she set aside without comment. Marin sat down and put her folded calculations on the table. Tell me what you're thinking, Zofia said. So Marin did. She laid out all of it. The Capstone sale, Griggs's visit, the blight, the math. The fact that she could cover her debt and come out ahead if she sold to the Meridian. The fact that her neighbors were going into a hard winter without the stores they'd planned on. The fact that she didn't know what the right price was for a jar of preserves in Red Basin in this particular winter, with everything the valley had just lost. Zofia listened without interrupting. When Marin finished, Zofia looked at the calculations for a moment and then looked at her. You already know what you're going to do, she said. I'm trying to make sure it's not foolish. It probably is a little foolish. Zofia said it plainly, not to discourage her. Most things worth doing are. She poured 2 cups of tea and pushed one across the table. What's the number that covers your debt and leaves you stable? Marin had already worked this out. If I sell 60 jars in Red Basin at a fair price, not Griggs's price, not the Meridian price, something a working family can manage, I cover the debt. If I keep 30 back and get Mrs. Deckard's price on them, I have enough for winter and a start on spring. And the other 35? Marin wrapped her hands around the cup. I don't know yet. Zofia was quiet for a moment. There are families in this valley who are counting on their own preserves to get through February and March. They won't buy at city prices. I know. And you're not in a position to give them away. I know that too. So, Zofia picked up her tea. You sell at a price that's honest, not generous to the point of stupidity, not exploitative to the point of Griggs. Honest. She looked at Marin steadily. The question isn't what the market will bear. You've been asking the wrong question. Marin looked at her. The question, Zofia said, is what those jars are worth to someone who is going to feed their children through March with them. That's not the same number as what they're worth to a hotel in Capstone. She set down her cup. Both are true, and you have to decide which truth you're living in. Marin drove home in the dark with the lantern swaying on the wagon hook and the mule moving steadily on the familiar road, and she let the question settle into the silence the way questions need to settle when you're done fighting them. She already knew. Zofia was right about that. She'd known before she drove to Zofia's house. She'd maybe known since the day she stood in the Callaway orchard and looked at the blighted trees and understood what the winter was going to hold. The only thing left was how to do it in a way that didn't let Griggs profit from her decision. And that was a different problem. Harder in some ways because it required not just courage, but strategy. And strategy required knowing exactly what ground you were standing on before you moved. She went home and found her copy of the land note at the back of the drawer where she kept important papers. She sat down at the kitchen table, moved the lamp close, and read every line of it again. Slowly, the way she should have been reading it all along, looking not for what it said, but for what it didn't say. It took her 2 hours. By the end, her tea was cold, and she had 3 pages of careful notes in her own handwriting and a clear picture of exactly where Griggs's authority ended. She folded the notes and put them with the land note. Then she went to the shelf and counted her jars one more time in the lamplight. 125. Enough for what she was planning, if she was precise about it. Barely enough, maybe. But enough. She reached into the flour-covered tin on the back shelf. Not the one with the money, the other one, the one she reached into less often, and took out her mother's silver brooch. She held it in her palm for a moment. The leaves around the edge, worn smooth. Ruth's brooch, which had felt like a reproach sitting in the tin, was going back where it belonged. She pinned it to her collar. Then she blew out the lamp and went to bed, and for the first time in several weeks, she slept without dreaming about numbers. The news spread through Red Basin the way bad news always spread, faster than anyone meant for it to, landing in kitchens and at feed store counters and along the road between neighbors, accumulating weight with each telling. The full scale of the blight was finally being talked about plainly. 3 orchards completely lost. 2 more at partial loss. The valley's peach stores for the season, gone. Marin heard people's voices change when they talked about it now. Not panic, exactly. Frontier people tended to convert panic into grim calculation faster than city people did, because they'd learned that panic didn't put food on the table. But underneath the calculation, there was something raw and worried that she recognized, because she'd felt it herself in various forms over the last 2 years. She went to market to buy salt, and came back knowing that people had started to hear about her jars. Not in detail. Nobody knew her numbers or her plans, but the way rumors work, the shadow of the thing had arrived before the thing itself. The widow Ashcroft had preserved the hail fruit. She had something. How much was unclear. What she was going to do with it was also unclear. On her way back from town, she passed Griggs's store and saw him talking to 2 men she didn't know on the porch. He saw her on the wagon and held her gaze for a moment. Not hostile, not friendly, measuring. She drove on without stopping. At home, she found Finn on her porch with a piece of paper. He held it out when she climbed down from the wagon. Mrs. Mercer asked me to give you this, he said. His voice was carefully neutral. Marin unfolded it. There was a note in a woman's handwriting, direct and without preamble. She'd heard about the preserves, she'd heard about the blight. She was asking whether Marin might be willing to sell at fair price before market day, privately, to avoid the trouble of the public market. She listed a price that was reasonable, but still below what Marin had calculated as her honest number. She folded the note, looked at Finn. She's worried, he said, about the winter. She has her daughter's family staying through spring. That's 4 more mouths than she planned for. Marin put the note in her coat pocket. I know, she said. I know she is. She went inside and stood at the window for a moment. The trees on the north pasture were bare now, stripped down to their essential shape, each branch visible against the white sky. From here she could see the fence line Thomas had been building when the fever started. The posts were still there, weathered gray, waiting. She turned away from the window. Market day was 6 days out, and she had a great deal to do. She spent the 6 days before market doing 3 things: preparing the jars, preparing the numbers, and preparing herself. The jars were the easiest part. She wiped each one down with a clean cloth, checked every seal a final time, and arranged them by batch on the kitchen shelves in the order she planned to bring them out. She'd decided on 80 jars for the public market, enough to make a real difference to the families who needed them, not so many that she couldn't manage the transaction alone. 30 went aside for Mrs. Deckard, packed carefully in straw in the 2 wooden crates she'd gotten from the Dempsey place. 5 she set apart in a separate row on the top shelf. Those weren't for sale. The numbers took longer. She worked through them for 3 evenings straight, sitting at the kitchen table after Finn left, the lamp turned up high, going over her costs with the kind of precision that felt almost cruel. Because when you add up every cent you've spent on something you've also bled over, the final number feels smaller than it should. She had spent in total $4.11 on raw materials: sugar, paraffin, the original 2 crates of peaches. She had not counted the jars she'd salvaged or the labor, which was either everything or nothing depending on how you looked at it. She had spent lamp oil and firewood and several weeks of her life. She had spent the 60 cents that had come directly from the tin behind the flour sack, which was the most painful part of the math even now. At $1.30 per jar, the Meridian would pay $39 for the 30 she was setting aside. That covered the principal on Griggs's note with money left over. The remaining 80 jars sold in Red Basin, she'd settled on 75 cents each, which was below city price and above what Griggs had offered her, and which she'd arrived at by asking herself honestly what she would have paid for a jar of peach preserves if the roles were reversed, and she was the one going into a hard winter with empty shelves. 75 cents felt like something a person could absorb without desperation. $60 for 80 jars, plus 39 from Capstone, minus 65 to Griggs approximately. That left her somewhere between $30 and $35 ahead, which was not wealth, but was the specific kind of margin that meant she could buy seed in the spring without borrowing. She looked at the numbers for a long time. Then she folded the paper and put it in her coat pocket, where it would stay until she needed it. The third thing, preparing herself, was harder to describe and mostly happened without her consciously directing it. She thought about her mother, who had put up preserves with the quiet conviction of someone doing necessary and dignified work. She thought about Thomas at the stove in his undershirt, making griddle cakes on Sunday mornings, being a person who took small pleasures seriously. She thought about Finn's gray eyes, tracking things, calculating quietly. She thought about Zofia saying both truths are true, and you have to decide which one you're living in. She thought about Griggs standing on her porch, without his hat in his hands the second time, the pleasantness gone, the indifference showing through, the way he'd reminded her of her debt like it was a door he could close in front of her. And she thought about the land note and the 3 pages of careful notes she'd made by lamplight, and what she now understood about exactly where his authority ended and where hers began. On the evening before market day, she took her mother's brooch off her collar and looked at it one more time. Then she pinned it back on and left it there. Market day in Red Basin happened on the 2nd Saturday of each month, in the open space between the general store and the feed barn, which was large enough for a dozen wagons and usually held about 8. It was not a grand affair even in good years. A few vendors, the trading of goods and information, the particular social energy of people who didn't see each other often enough making the most of proximity. In November, it was sparse. Cold kept people home. But this November was different, and Marin knew it would be before she arrived. She'd hitched the wagon early and loaded it carefully, jars upright, packed snug enough not to rattle, covered with the good canvas tarp until she was ready. She'd put on her best practical coat, which wasn't a dress coat but was clean and well kept, and she'd left her hair pinned properly instead of the rough knot she usually wore for work. Not for vanity. For the same reason a lawyer wears a particular kind of suit when presenting a case, to signal that what you are presenting is worth taking seriously. Finn appeared at the edge of her property just as she was finishing the loading. He hadn't been asked to come. He was wearing his better shirt and a coat that was 2 sizes too large, probably borrowed from someone at the Mercer farm. She looked at him. "I'm not in the way," he said. "No," she agreed. "You're not." He climbed up on the wagon bench without further discussion, and they rode into town together in the early morning quiet, the loaded jars behind them making no sound at all in the straw. The market space was busier than a normal November Saturday. Marin noticed it as she turned the wagon onto the main street. More horses at the hitching posts, more people than the usual thin November crowd, clusters of conversation along the storefront walks that had the slightly charged energy of people who've been talking about something and have paused only because a new element has arrived. She'd known people would come. Word of what she had and what the blight had taken had been building for days. She'd counted on it, in fact, had made sure, through Finn, through a carefully placed comment to Hector Blaine, through nothing that could be called a direct announcement, that the people of Red Basin knew she would be at market with the Stormfire gold. What she hadn't counted on exactly was the sight of Griggs already positioned in front of his store with 2 of his regular men at his shoulders, watching her wagon pull in with the particular stillness of a man who is prepared for something. She drove past him without looking directly at him and pulled the wagon to a stop in the center of the market space, in the open ground between the store and the feed barn where everyone could see it from all directions. She climbed down, uncovered the jars. The sound the gathered crowd made wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a gasp or an exclamation. It was more of a collective settling, the sound of many people adjusting their understanding of something at the same time. In the gray November light, the jars were vivid and warm, amber and deep gold, catching what little sun the morning offered and throwing it back. 119 people could not have told you exactly why a row of preserve jars was beautiful, but standing there in the cold with winter coming and the orchard stripped bare, they felt it anyway. Marin let them look for a moment. Then she said, in a voice that carried but wasn't raised, "Good morning." Several people returned the greeting. Several more moved closer. She had thought about how to begin this. She had drafted versions of it in her head over the last several days and discarded most of them. Anything that sounded like a sales pitch, anything that sounded like a speech, anything that started from the premise that she needed to convince people of something. She didn't want to convince. She wanted to account. "Most of you know what these are," she said, "and most of you know what they cost me to make." She paused. "I want to tell you some of it that you might not know." She told them about the 60 cents, about the decision at the Callaway orchard, standing in the mud with everyone walking away, turning the peach over in her hands and seeing that what was broken on the outside was still something real underneath. She told them about the nights of work, the failed batch, the morning she'd sat on the floor for 10 minutes before she could get up again. She told them about Finn finding jars in the Dempsey root cellar with his coat full of cobwebs, about Zofia and her borrowed jars and what she'd said about scarred fruit. She told it plainly, without decoration, the way you tell things that are actually true. Not smoothly, not in the right order every time, with a small correction here and a reconsideration there. The crowd had grown. She could see people at the edges who hadn't been there when she'd started. The Callaway family, which she hadn't expected. The widow Prentice. Hector Blaine with his hat in his hands. Several families she knew by sight and not well by name. A few people she didn't recognize at all. And at the back, near the edge of the store porch, Griggs, still, watching. "I drove to Capstone," she said. "I sold 12 jars to the Meridian Hotel at a city price, and I came home and sat at my table for a long time thinking about what that meant. Because the money made sense, and because it didn't account for everything." She looked out at the gathered faces. "This valley is going into a hard winter. You know that better than I need to tell you. I know what most of you were counting on to get your families through February and March, and I know what the blight took." She was steady. She thought she might not be, had worried, in the nights leading up to this, that her voice would go tight at the wrong moment. But it didn't. These jars were made from what got thrown away, from what everyone called worthless. I want to sell them to you at a price that's honest. Honest about what they cost me, and honest about what a working family can carry. 75 cents a jar. A sound moved through the crowd. Not protest. Something more like recognition. The particular response you get when a number lands in the right place, between what people feared and what they'd hoped. She heard Dorothea Hicks, somewhere to her left, say something she couldn't quite make out. Whatever it was, nobody agreed with it aloud. Before I open for purchase, Marin said, there's something else I want to tell you. This was the part she'd been the most careful about. The part she'd written out and then rewritten, because the line between accountability and score settling was a real line, and she intended to stay on the right side of it. When the hailstorm came, one person in this town saw an opportunity. He bought Callaway's ruined crop for 4 cents a bushel, which was less than worthless, and everyone knew it. And he sold me 2 crates of those same ruined peaches for 30 cents each because he thought he was getting the better end of something. She kept her voice factual. After I made these preserves, he came to my door and offered me 60 cents a jar for the lot. He had a first rights clause in my land note that he implied covered independent commercial sales, a legal interpretation I've since had reason to examine carefully, and which does not, in fact, hold up under the actual language of the document. She let that sit for one breath. He also told me that my patience had limits. What he meant by that was that my debt to him was a door he could close. She could not see Griggs's face clearly from here. She could see that he hadn't moved. I'm not telling you this to make a villain of anyone. I'm telling you because you are the people who do business in this town, and you deserve to know what kind of business is being done. You deserve to know the difference between someone who bought damaged goods cheap and turned them into something real, and someone who waited to see whether that work could be bought cheap too. She paused. I'll repay my debt to Mr. Griggs in full on this market day, from these sales. Every cent, principal and interest. After that, I owe him nothing, and he has no claim on my work. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was the full kind. The kind that means everyone is processing at the same time, comparing what they'd heard with what they already knew, fitting the new information against the shape of their own experiences doing business in Red Basin. Hector Blaine was the first one to step forward. He came through the small gap in the front of the crowd and held out 3 quarters without saying much. 2 jars, please, Mrs. Ashcroft. She handed them over. After Blaine, it was the Callaway son, the younger one, not the one who'd made the joke at the feed store, who came forward and bought 3 jars and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, my father says, thank you for taking a chance on our fruit. Marin said, tell him it was good fruit. That's all it needed. They came in a steady stream after that. Not a rush. Orderly, the way people are when they're buying something they've decided to value. She made change from the small box she'd brought, kept track on the paper in her pocket, handed over jars with both hands because they were heavy, and because handing something over with both hands means you know it has weight. The widow Prentice came and looked at the jars for a moment before deciding, the way old women sometimes do when they're holding something against their memories. My husband used to put up peaches every fall, she said, not to Marin specifically, just out loud. These are good ones, Marin said, not perfect, but good. The widow Prentice bought 2 jars and touched the lid of one with her fingertip in a way that was private enough that Marin looked away. Griggs crossed the market ground toward her when the initial crowd had thinned, maybe 40 minutes into the morning, when she'd sold somewhere close to 50 jars. He came without his men this time, which she noted. He stood at the side of the wagon and looked at the remaining jars and then at her. That was a public accusation, he said. It was a public account, she said. I named no one. People knew who you meant. People who knew had already done business with you, she said. What they made of it is their own. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the jars, at what remained, at what had already sold. He was still doing math. She'd come to understand that about him. He was always doing math, and the math was always about leverage. The note, he said. What you said about the first rights clause. I said what I found when I read it carefully. I could dispute that interpretation. You could. She looked at him directly. That would require engaging a lawyer and making a formal claim, which would require making public the terms of the note and the history of the interest calculations, which I've also looked at carefully. She let that land. I'll have your money by end of market day, Mr. Griggs. Full amount. In exchange, I'll want the note marked paid and returned to me. Another pause. She could see him measuring things. Not just her, but the crowd around them, the changed temperature of the market ground, the way people had been looking at her and then at him since she'd spoken. The math had shifted, and he knew it. I'll have the note ready, he said. He walked back to his store without turning around. Well, Finn appeared at her elbow about 10 minutes later, as though he'd been waiting for the conversation to finish before surfacing. He didn't push back, he said. He pushed where he could, Marin said. There wasn't much room. Finn looked at the remaining jars. She counted quickly, somewhere around 45 left. You did it right, he said. What you said. You didn't make it into something bigger than it was. She looked at him. He was 11 years old and standing in a too large borrowed coat, and he had just described, with more precision than most adults could manage, the exact calibration she'd been trying to hold. Thank you, she said. He shrugged, the contained shrug, looked at the jars. You want me to hand them over while you make change? Yes, she said. That would help. They worked together for the next hour and a half, Finn lifting jars from the wagon bed as people selected, Marin making change and noting each sale on her paper. It was quiet, useful work, and they fell into a rhythm the way they'd fallen into all their rhythms over the past weeks, without discussion, each adjusting to the other. Dorothea Hicks came eventually. She stood at the wagon for a moment with a complicated expression, the look of a woman who has been wrong about something and is weighing whether to acknowledge it. I may have been hasty, she said, in my comments. Earlier in the season, Marin handed a jar to a man she didn't know, noted the sale. It's a hard thing, she said, to know what a person is capable of before they've done it. Dorothea Hicks bought one jar, and when she paid, she put down an extra coin and said it was for the work, and walked away before Marin could hand it back. By noon, she had 9 jars left on the wagon. She counted the money in the box. Not the final tally, she'd do that at home, but enough to confirm what she needed to know. She had enough. More than enough. The 30 jars she'd set aside for Capstone were still at the homestead, and the payment from the Meridian would arrive when she made the delivery next week. But what she had in the box right now was enough to cover Griggs's note and carry her through to spring planting. She left Finn with the wagon and walked to the general store. Griggs was behind the counter when she came in, and he was alone, which she thought he'd arranged deliberately. He had the land note on the counter in front of him, unfolded, a single sheet of paper that had held a particular kind of power over her life for 3 years, and which looked, in the plain light of the store, like what it actually was, a piece of paper. She counted the money onto the counter. She'd done this count 3 times at the wagon, so she knew it was right, but she counted it again in front of him because she wanted the act to be witnessed by both of them, and she wanted there to be no ambiguity about what was happening. 53 principal, she said, and 1140 in interest, which is what you get if you calculate at the rate specified in the note from the date of Thomas's death, which is when sole ownership transferred. She set the last coin down. 64.40 total. He counted it himself. He would. She'd expected that. He moved the coins and the bills with the experienced hands of someone who had counted money across a counter for 30 years, and when he was done, he looked up at her. Paid, he said. He picked up a pen and wrote across the face of the note in the margin, paid in full, the date, his signature, and folded it and pushed it across the counter. She picked it up. It weighed nothing. She folded it once more and put it in her coat pocket, against the folded arithmetic paper she'd been carrying for 6 days, and walked back out into the market ground. The afternoon light was low and pale by the time most people had cleared out. The market ground had the particular afternoon emptiness of a place that had been full of people and was now returning to itself. Wagon ruts in the frozen ground, a scrap of paper someone had dropped, the smell of the morning's activity still faintly in the air. Marin sat on the wagon bench with the money box on her knees and Finn beside her, and they looked at the 9 remaining jars in the wagon bed. What do you want to do with those? Finn asked. She thought about it. She'd been thinking about those 9 jars since before market day, in the back of her mind where she put the question she wasn't ready to answer yet. "I'm keeping 3, she said, "for the winter." "And the other 6? She climbed down from the wagon and went to the back, lifted 2 jars, and carried them across the empty market ground toward Zofia, who had come in the early afternoon and bought 2 jars and hadn't left yet, had stayed at the edge of things, watching, in the way she stayed at the edge of most things, which was not peripheral but was her own form of being present. Marin held out the 2 jars. Zofia looked at them, then at Marin. "I already bought 2, she said. "These aren't for sale." Zofia took the jars slowly. She looked at them for a moment, at the color, at the light through the glass. She pressed her lips together once in the expression she made when she didn't want to say something but was going to anyway. "Your mother would have been proud," she said. Just that. Then she turned and walked toward where she'd tied her horse, carrying the jars carefully in the crook of her arm. Marin went back to the wagon. She loaded the remaining 4 jars into the crook of her own arm and walked toward where Finn was standing, watching her. "Here," she said, and held 2 out to him. He looked at them the way he looked at unexpected things, with that careful processing pause, checking to see if there was a catch. "For me?" "For you, for your winter." She paused. "You earned more than 2 jars, Finn, I know that. When I'm on better footing in the spring, I'm going to make that right properly. But for now." He took the jars. He held them carefully, the way he'd held every jar they'd ever worked with together, knowing the weight of them, knowing what they'd taken to make. "I know you will," he said. His voice was matter of fact, not trusting easily, not grateful in a performed way, just believing her, which was its own kind of thing. The kind of thing that meant he'd watched her work and drawn a conclusion, and he wasn't wrong. She kept 2 for herself and climbed back up on the wagon bench. The afternoon was going fast, the light already starting to flatten toward evening. "You need a ride back?" she asked. "No," he said. "I'll walk." He tucked the 2 jars carefully inside the large coat, one on each side, so his arms held them against his ribs. He looked for a moment like a boy carrying the most important things he owned, which was probably close to true. "Mrs. Ashcroft." "Finn." It was a good day. She looked at the empty wagon, at the money box, at the folded land note in her pocket that she could feel the edge of through the fabric, at the market ground going quiet in the early winter afternoon, at the 9 impressions in the straw where the last jars had sat. "Yes," she said. "It was." She turned the wagon toward home. The mule moved steadily on the frozen road, and the town fell away behind her, and the sky was the particular dark blue of a November late afternoon that has used up all its light, and Marin Ashcroft drove with the reins loose in her hands and the money box between her feet and her mother's brooch on her collar. And she did not think about everything that was still hard, or everything that was still uncertain, or the fence posts in the north pasture that still needed finishing. She thought about the jars. 137 of them, made from what everyone had thrown away. Not perfect. Every single one of them made by her own hands from something broken, in the nights when nobody was watching. She drove home through the early dark and the cold air, and the sound of the wheels on the road was steady and even, and that was enough. The house felt different when she got home, not in any way she could point to specifically. The same walls, the same lamp she'd left burning low on the table, the same smell of wood smoke and faintly, still, of cooked peaches that had soaked into the ceiling boards over the weeks of work and wasn't going to come out until spring at the earliest. But something had shifted in the quality of the silence. It wasn't the silence of waiting, which was what the house had felt like for most of the past 3 years. Waiting for something to resolve, for the debt to come due, for the other shoe. This was just quiet. The ordinary quiet of a house at the end of a day. She unhitched the mule and made sure he had water and feed, which took longer than usual because her hands were cold and stiff and she kept fumbling the buckles. She didn't rush it. The mule was patient in the way old animals get patient. Not happy, not unhappy, just present with whatever was happening. She appreciated that about him. Inside, she set the money box on the table and took off her coat and hung it on the hook by the door, and she stood for a moment in the kitchen looking at the shelves. 3 jars left on the top shelf, the ones she'd kept for herself. They caught the lamplight the same way they always had, amber and deep, and they looked smaller now against the empty space where more than 100 others had been. But they didn't look diminished. If anything, they looked more themselves, 3 jars that had survived the culling, still warm in the light. She made tea and sat down and opened the money box and did the final count. The arithmetic took a while because she kept checking it. Not because she thought she'd made a mistake, but because the number kept coming back the same and she wasn't used to that. The number came back the same every time. After repaying Griggs, after accounting for the day's sales, after setting aside what she'd need for the capstone delivery and the travel and the small overhead of the coming weeks, she had $31 and some change that belonged to no one and was owed for nothing. $31. She sat with that for a while. It was not a fortune. She was clear-eyed enough not to call it one. The homestead still needed the fence completed along the north pasture. The mule's lame leg was an ongoing conversation with itself that she'd need to address before spring planting. The roof over the back storage room had a soft spot she'd been watching since August. There were a dozen places this money could go before it would be gone, and probably half of them were more urgent than anything resembling comfort. But tonight she left the money in the box and closed the lid and put it on the shelf next to the 3 jars, and she drank her tea and let herself sit in the ordinary quiet of a house that didn't owe anyone anything. She drove to Capstone the following Thursday, the 30 jars packed in straw, and delivered them to Mrs. Deckard at the Meridian service entrance the same way she'd delivered the first 12, so quietly, through the back, no ceremony. Mrs. Deckard counted them, looked them over with the same precise attention she'd given the first batch, and handed Marin $39 in an envelope. "These are going to do well," Mrs. Deckard said. She wasn't a woman who gave compliments as social currency, so when she said something like that, it landed differently. The dining room sold through the first 12 in 2 weeks. People asked about them. "Asked what?" Marin said. "Where they came from, what the story was." Mrs. Deckard looked at her briefly. "I told them it was a frontier preserve from a single orchard valley, that the season had been hard." She paused. "People like knowing something about what they eat, that it came from somewhere real." Marin thought about that on the drive home, that it came from somewhere real. She'd never thought of what she was selling that way, as a story as much as a product. But Mrs. Deckard was right that they were the same thing, in the end. The story was in the jars. The bruised fruit, the night she hadn't slept, Finn's scraped knees, Zophia's borrowed mason jars, and the things she'd said about scarred fruit. You couldn't taste that exactly, but somehow you could. Not in the way of sentiment, in the way that food made by someone who was paying real attention tastes different from food made by someone who isn't. She arrived back in Red Basin in the late afternoon, and when she turned onto the main street, she noticed, almost without registering it consciously at first, that the quality of people's greetings had changed. Not dramatically. Not in the way of stories where a town collectively reverses itself in a moment of sudden clarity. It was subtler than that, and more true. A woman she barely knew nodded at her from across the street with a directness that wasn't there before. Hector Blaine, coming out of the feed barn, said, "Mrs. Ashcroft?" and tipped his hat with a seriousness that meant something more than courtesy. Even the way people held themselves when she passed seemed slightly adjusted, the minor recalibration of people who have updated their understanding of someone. She noticed it and set it aside and drove home, because she had learned over the past several weeks to be careful about what she let mean too much. Griggs's influence didn't collapse dramatically either. That was the honest version of what happened, and she thought honesty was owed to the story, even if it was less satisfying than the cleaner alternative. He was still there. He still had his store, his connections, his notes on other people's land. He had not been ruined or driven out or publicly shamed in any permanent way. She had not set out to do those things, and she hadn't done them. What had happened was more like a small shift in a foundation. The kind of shift you don't see directly, but that changes how everything built on top of it sits. People talked. They talked the way they'd been talking about Marin all season, except that the direction had changed. She'd heard the version where she was the foolish widow throwing money at garbage fruit. Now there was another version moving through the same channels, and this one included what Griggs had offered her for the jars, and what she'd turned down, and what she'd set at market, and why. People who'd done business with Griggs for years found themselves looking back at that business through a slightly different window, asking questions they hadn't thought to ask before. She didn't know what would come of that precisely. She didn't think she was owed a specific outcome. She had told the truth in the market ground, and what people did with it was their own business. That felt like the right amount of involvement to have had. What she knew was that when Silas Calloway came to her door 2 weeks after market day, to ask whether she'd be interested in purchasing the salvageable portion of his late peach crop again next season. Not the hail damage, which you couldn't plan for, but the regular fall surplus that he sometimes struggled to sell before it turned. She said yes before he finished the sentence. He looked at her for a moment after that, standing on her porch with his hat in his hands the way men in Red Basin held their hats when they were being earnest about something. "He offered me 4 cents a bushel again this year," Calloway said. "He didn't say who. I told him I was considering other arrangements." "I'll pay 12, Marin said. "For sound fruit, 10 for anything with damage." Calloway looked at the number for a moment. "That's fair," he said, in the voice of a man who had not always been paid fair and recognized it when it arrived. "I think so," Marin said. "Same terms for the Bellamy orchard, if they're interested." He said he thought they would be, and left, and she stood in the doorway for a moment after he'd gone and felt something unfamiliar and quiet that she eventually identified as the sensation of a thing being built rather than a thing being survived. Basa. Finn came by on a Sunday in late November with both jars, empty and washed. She was at the table when he knocked, going through the seed catalog she'd sent for from the Capstone agricultural supplier, an extravagance she'd permitted herself with 2 of the $31, partly for practical reasons, and partly because ordering a seed catalog felt like a declaration of intention about the future. She opened the door and looked at the jars. "Those are yours," she said. "I know." He held them out. "I ate what was in them. They were good." He said it the way he said everything that mattered, factually, without performance. "I wanted to return the jars. For next season." She took the jars, looked at them, clean, carefully washed, the lids set in the rings properly so they wouldn't rust over winter. "Next season," she said. "If you're doing it again." He paused. "Are you?" She stepped back from the door. "Come in. There's tea." He came in and sat at the kitchen table, and she put the kettle on, and for a moment it felt like any of the dozens of mornings they'd worked together. The quiet kitchen, the 2 of them falling naturally into the same space without friction or effort. Except the stove wasn't running, and the shelves were mostly empty, and the only jars in the room were the 3 she'd kept and the 2 he'd just returned. "I'm doing it again," she said. "Different, probably. Better, maybe, if I do it right." She poured the water. "I've been thinking about what else can be done with damaged fruit, not just peaches. There's a pear orchard on the far side of the valley that had blight problems last year, and I talked to the Bellamy son about their apple surplus." Finn wrapped his hands around the cup. "You could do a lot more than 130 jars." "If I had more jars," she said, "and more hands." He looked at her across the table. The gray eyes, still careful, still calculating. "I'm available," he said. "Next season." She looked back at him. She thought about what she'd said on market day. "When I'm on better footing in the spring, I'm going to make that right properly." And about the way he'd said "I know you will" with the flatness of someone who had learned to protect themselves from disappointment but had made a calculated exception. "When I said I'd make it right," she said, "I meant wages, not jars." Something moved in his face, fast, controlled, the way all his expressions moved. "Actual wages. Yes. Per day, or per day. Fair rate. Same as I'd pay any adult hand, because you work the same as any adult hand." He was quiet for a moment. She watched him process it the way she'd watched him process things all season. Not with his face exactly, more with his stillness, the way he went very quiet when something required real consideration. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she agreed. They drank their tea, and outside the November wind was doing its business with the bare trees, and the afternoon light was the thin white of late autumn, and the kitchen was warm. After a while, Finn said, "What are you going to call it? The business, I mean, if it's bigger next season." Marin looked at the 3 jars on the shelf. "I've been thinking about that. Stormfire Gold is a good name." "It is," she said. "I'm going to keep it. But..." The last thing she did before December came was finish the fence. She hadn't planned to do it in November. It was cold work, harder than it needed to be with the ground beginning to freeze, and there was no practical urgency to it. The north pasture was empty, had been empty since she'd sold the second mule, and nothing was going to escape through the gap in the fence line where Thomas had left off. It was not a sensible use of time. But she'd looked in those posts from the kitchen window every morning for 2 years, and she was tired of looking at them. She got the tools from the shed, the post mallet, the wire, the stretcher Thomas had built himself from salvaged hardwood, and she walked out to the north pasture in the early morning cold and stood at the last finished post and looked at the gap, 30 feet, maybe 35, to the corner post. Not much. She'd never done fence work before. Thomas had done it, and before Thomas she'd lived in town and hadn't had occasion to learn. She made mistakes, set one post at the wrong angle and had to pull it and reset, which took an hour she hadn't budgeted. Nicked her hand on the wire stretcher and bled more than the wound warranted through the cold, which made the work messy and annoying. The tension on the second run of wire wasn't right, and she had to go back and adjust it twice. By the time she drove the last staple into the corner post, the light was going. She walked back along the completed fence line, all of it, from the gate to the corner and back, running her gloved hand along the top wire, feeling the tension even and solid under her fingers. It wasn't beautiful fencing. A professional would have found things to criticize, but it was done, and it was sound, and nothing was going to go through it that wasn't supposed to. She stood at the corner post and looked back at the house. Kitchen window, lamp burning inside. Smoke from the chimney. The 3 jars she knew were on the shelf, catching the last light from inside. She thought about Thomas standing at this same spot, setting this same corner post neighbor, whistling tunelessly the way he did when he was working steadily. She thought about him deciding on this particular piece of land because of the well, because he'd walked the whole property first and found the water and said, "This is the one," and she'd trusted his judgment, and his judgment had been right even if he hadn't stayed long enough to finish everything he'd started. She didn't feel the absence of him the same way she had a year ago. It had become something she carried differently. Not lighter, exactly, but redistributed, like a load you've been carrying long enough that your body has adjusted and you can go longer distances with it than you thought. She wasn't over it. She didn't think you got over things like that. You just got more practiced at going on. She picked up the tools and carried them back to the shed and put them away in the right places, which Thomas had always been particular about. Every tool in its place so you could find it in the dark. And she locked the shed and walked back to the house and went inside. In the years that came after, people in Red Basin would refer to that winter in different ways, depending on what it had meant to them. The bad winter, the blight year, the year of the preserves. Some people would say it was the year Bartholomew Griggs started losing his grip on the valley's commerce. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, in the way that authority erodes when people start asking the question. It was built on their not asking. He stayed. He adapted, somewhat. He was still there 5 years later, still running his store, but the room he took up had quietly shrunk. Myron didn't think about it in those terms. She wasn't interested in Griggs's trajectory. She had her own to manage. What she thought about, when she thought about that season, was simpler and more personal and harder to articulate to someone who hadn't been in her kitchen at 2 a.m. with a batch on the stove and doubt sitting heavy in the chair across from her. She thought about the moment in the Callaway orchard when she'd turned the bruised peach over in her hands. That was the moment everything hinged on, though she hadn't known it then. Not the market day speech, not the trip to Capstone, not the confrontation with Griggs. Those were all downstream of the moment she'd looked at a piece of damaged fruit and decided that damaged wasn't the same as worthless. That there was still something real inside it. That the bruise was on the surface, and the flesh beneath was still the flesh. She'd been doing that, she came to understand, her whole life. Looking at things that had been marked as done, as over, as not worth the trouble, and finding the part that wasn't. Thomas's unfinished fence, the Dempsey root cellar with its collapsed entrance, Finn Mercer, 11 years old and already so practiced at being overlooked that he'd built the practice into himself like insulation. Herself, maybe. The widow everyone expected to give up and leave, who kept finding reasons not to. This was not a lesson she'd learned in a single season. It was something she'd always known without being able to name it, and the season had given her a name for it. That was what hard things did sometimes, if you were paying enough attention. They didn't teach you things you didn't know. They showed you things you'd always known and hadn't yet claimed. Spring came the way spring always came in the valley, reluctantly, in pieces, The cold giving ground 1 degree at a time with the grudging quality of someone losing an argument they'd expected to win. Marin was in the kitchen when the first real morning of it arrived. The kind of morning when the light through the window was different, warmer by some quality that wasn't measurable but was unmistakable to anyone who'd waited for it. She stood at the window with her tea and looked at the north pasture fence, straight and solid and finished, and the bare trees starting to show the first suggestion of buds along their branches. Finn arrived at 7, on time as he always was, in a coat that fit him slightly better. She'd traded 2 days of preserved goods to Mrs. Mercer for the alteration, which was a transaction she'd been direct about, and Mrs. Mercer had accepted with the pragmatism of a woman who understood that children needed coats that fit and that there was no shame in the arrangement that provided it. He knocked once and came in when she said come, and he looked at the table where the season's planning was laid out. The seed catalog, the notes on the Callaway and Bellamy arrangements, the new jar order she'd placed with the supplier in Capstone, the small ledger she'd bought with the last of the $31 and started keeping properly. He picked up the ledger and looked at the first page. "You started accounting," he said. "If it's a business, it needs a ledger." He set it down and looked at the planning papers with the systematic attention he brought to everything. "The Bellamy apple surplus, when do they want to confirm?" "Before planting, so this month." He nodded. "I can go with you to talk to them if you want." She looked at him. He was 12 now, or nearly. She didn't know his exact birthday, and he seemed not to either. He was taller than he'd been in October, the way children are taller in the spring than you remember them being in the fall, as though the winter had done something to them that the warm months then reveal. His voice was starting to change in the subtle way that meant it would change completely within a year. "That would be useful," she said. "You negotiated the jar count from the Dempsey cellar better than I would have." He almost smiled. "Not quite." "I just counted them." "You counted them honestly?" she said. "That's not nothing." They sat down at the table together and went through the season's plan the way they'd worked through everything. Methodically, practically, each checking the other's math without being asked, comfortable with silence and with disagreement in equal measure. She'd been wrong about the sugar ratios twice the previous season, and he'd told her so both times, directly, without softening it or second-guessing himself. She'd adjusted. That was how it worked. Outside, the morning was getting lighter by degrees, the pale spring light filling the kitchen gradually, warming the table, reaching the shelf where the 3 jars still stood, the ones she'd kept for winter, now empty and washed and waiting for the next season's use, because nothing was wasted if you paid attention. Zofia came in the afternoon, as she sometimes did now, not on a schedule, just when she had something to bring or say or check on. She arrived with a jar of her preserved beets and a question about whether Marin had considered expanding to berries, which you could sometimes salvage after hail damage the same way you could salvage stone fruit if you were fast enough about it. The 3 of them sat at the kitchen table, Marin, Finn, Zofia, and talked through the berry question with the practical, unglamorous specificity of people who were actually going to do a thing and needed to know whether the thing was worth doing. Zofia thought it was, with conditions. Finn thought the jar supply would need to scale proportionally. Marin thought the price point would be different and needed research. None of them resolved it that afternoon. They got further into it than they'd started, which was enough. When Zofia left, she paused at the door and looked at Marin with the direct look she had, the one that didn't dress things up. "You look different than last fall," she said. "Different how?" Zofia considered it. "Like someone who knows where they're standing." Marin thought about that after she left. Like someone who knows where they're standing. Not like someone who has arrived somewhere. She hadn't arrived anywhere. She was still in the same homestead with the same mule and the same soft spot in the back roof she still hadn't fixed. Not like someone who had figured it out, because she hadn't and probably wouldn't. But knowing where you were standing was its own thing. It meant you knew which direction you were facing. It meant when you took a step, you knew something about the ground. She'd spent a long time not knowing that. Longer than just since Thomas died, there had been years before that too. Years of deferring the question of what she was building and for whom, of letting the shape of her life be defined by proximity and circumstance rather than by any real intention. Thomas had been good to her, and she'd been happy in the ways that are possible when you haven't fully asked yourself what you want yet. She didn't regret those years, but she understood them differently now. What she understood was that the season hadn't changed her. It had clarified her. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. She'd been all of this before the hailstorm. The stubbornness, the practical attention, the willingness to look at what was broken and ask what was still there. She just hadn't been required to use it at full capacity until the storm removed every easier option. That was what storms did, she thought. Not build you, require you. She was at the stove the evening of the first real warm day. Late April, the kitchen window opened for the first time since October, the smell of the thawing ground coming in on the air along with something green and early, the smell that was its own form of argument against hopelessness. When she found herself doing something she hadn't done since the fall, she was whistling. Not a tune exactly. The kind of tuneless whistling Thomas had done at the griddle on Sunday mornings. The kind that wasn't a performance, but a symptom of something. A side effect of the particular quality of being occupied and present and not at war with the moment you were in. She heard herself doing it and stopped. Then, after a moment, kept going. She was making the first test batch of the new season. Not from the Callaway fruit yet. That was months away. But from a small quantity of dried apples she'd bought from the Bellamy farm to test her ratios for the new product line. The kitchen smelled different from the peach batches, more tart, a different kind of warmth. She was still working out the sugar balance, and she'd already made one adjustment and wasn't sure it was right yet. On the shelf, 3 empty jars from last season, waiting. The ledger, open to the first blank page of the new year. The seed catalog, bookmarked in 3 places. On the counter, a letter from Mrs. Deckard at the Meridian received last week, asking about the season's availability and whether Stormfire Gold would be expanding its offerings. Marin had drafted a reply and then set it aside because she wasn't ready to commit to numbers yet, not until she'd worked through the ratios and had something she could actually stand behind. She didn't believe in promising what she wasn't sure she could deliver. That was the one thing she'd decided about how she was going to do business, before everything else. Not the prices, not the partnerships, not the expansion into apples or berries or whatever came next. Just that one thing. She would be honest about what she had, and honest about what she didn't. And she would not let the need to keep someone's good opinion make her say yes when she meant not yet. The batch needed another 10 minutes. She could feel it in the resistance when she stirred, the way the consistency had thickened but not quite finished. Not yet. Close, but not yet. She waited. That was another thing the season had taught her, or clarified, or simply required her to live. The particular discipline of waiting for a thing to be done, rather than declaring it done because you were tired of waiting. It was a harder skill than it sounded. It ran against something in human nature, the impulse to call things finished so you could move on. But the batches that failed had mostly failed because she'd moved too fast. The ones that held were the ones she'd given the time they needed. The kitchen filled with the smell of cooking apple, warm and slightly sharp, and the evening light came through the open window, and the tuneless whistling started up again without her deciding to. $31 and a ledger and a letter from Capstone and 2 empty jars waiting on the shelf. Finn coming back in the morning. Zofia 2 miles down the road with her kitchen full of beets and her strong opinions about berries. The Callaway orchard, not fully recovered but working its way back. The trees putting out buds along the damaged limbs because trees don't ask permission to try again. The fence, finished, along the north pasture. She took the batch off the heat at the right moment. She knew it the way she knew most things now, through attention accumulated into instinct, and began ladling it into the waiting jars. The first seal popped clean and firm. She set the jar on the shelf and picked up the next one, and kept working, steady and unhurried, in the warm kitchen with the window open and the spring evening coming in, and the new season already beginning in ways that didn't announce themselves but were there if you were paying attention. She was paying attention. That was all it had ever taken. That was all it would ever take. Not luck, not rescue, not the sudden arrival of easier circumstances. Just the willingness to stay in the room with what was hard long enough to learn what it was made of. To pick up the damaged thing and turn it over in your hands and ask, what's still here? What can this become? The jars filled up one by one, and outside the valley was quiet, and the season was starting, and Marin Ashcroft was already thinking about next year.